Let's discuss the 5 aspects of narrative with a glass of wine. Chin chin, everybody. So, in storytelling, there are 5 key aspects of narrative that will help you shape your world. They are voice, language, setting, structure, and form. These are your 5 base points to work off when constructing your story. Let's begin with the voice, shall we? There are 2 types of voices in your story, the narrative voice and the voices of your characters. The narrative voice is who we hear the story from. That can be a first-person narrator, a second-person narrator, or a third-person narrator. The first-person narrator is your I's and your we's and your me's, the internal dialogue of the main character. Think The Hunger Games, we see everything through the eyes of Katniss. The second-person narrator is your you's. You, the reader, become the main character of the story. You get sucked in. You go down the hallway, you open the door, and you get killed by the grizzly bear. It's your fault, you're the protagonist, this is all on you. R.L. Stine's The Goosebumps series. There's your second-person narrative in top form. The third-person narrative is your omniscient, nameless, faceless narrator who looks in on everything. They're not involved. They just tell you what's going on to other people. Now, I have an entire video on different forms of points of view and their pros and their cons, so if you want to watch that to find out which narrative voice you need to choose or is right for your story, then I will link it in the description below. There is also a link down there to my website and the link to the blog post that is the worded format of what I am telling you now, if you prefer to read things and have the notes there rather than me just talking at you and drinking wine in my living room. Once you've decided which narrative voice you're going to do, it's time to think about the voices of your each individual characters. So you need to know your characters to understand what kind of voice they need to have. For example, Hermione in Harry Potter, she's a bit of a know-it-all, she's smarter than the other 2 put together, and they would have died in book 1 without her, and that all comes across in her voice. We need to know the voices of the other characters to determine what kind of people they are. And that brings us on to language. The language helps form the voice. The type of language that a character chooses to use helps us determine what kind of person they are. For example, 19th century Mr. Darcy is unlikely to refer to Elizabeth Bennet as 100% 10 out of 10 would bang. He uses the language of the time period. He's stiff, he's pompous, he's very, very British, and that's the language he uses, and we defer his character from that. Certain things have an impact on what kind of language you use. For example, the time period the story is set in, or the type of person that is speaking. A working class Englishman from Yorkshire in the 19th century is going to speak very differently to a modern day middle class conservative politician. The one thing they have in common is they waffle a lot and it doesn't really mean anything. Research into the type of language you're going to use before you set into your story. I've got an entire video and post on where you need to be researching and unusual places you can research to find out the different types of language you can use in the description below. You've got a link to my blog and you've got a link to the video. Go, 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 go. The setting is what brings your world to life. I can't walk into your story without knowing what my feet are planted on, what my senses are smelling, seeing, hearing, tasting. I don't know, the air might have a tang to it. If you're in the middle of a country road, the air's kind of a little bit, you know, you can there's something. If you want your reader to feel uncomfortable, you isolate them in a weird setting that's going to make everyone feel uncomfortable. For example, if you were in the middle of the road on your own in the middle of the night, we know that there's something to fear in that because that is a situation and a setting we recognise as fearful and somewhere we need to be alert. If you set your story on the top of a hill in a Gothic castle, we know there's probably something creepy living in that and the reader doesn't necessarily want the character to go in there alone, but they do anyway, and that's how we end up with Dracula. What a beautiful story. As Phoebe Buffay said in her English class, I think the wildness of the moors represent the wildness of Heathcliff's character. Heathcliff. Him. And it's true. You need to think about what kind of setting you're placing your characters in for us to know what kind of people they are and for us to have an emotional reaction to it. Think about what kind of an emotional response you want to create in the reader, and that's where you set your piece. The structure of it all also has a massive impact on what kind of narrative we're going to get from you. For example, Frankenstein, we start at the end, it's cyclica. We start on now. What is the bloke called? He is called Robert Walton. We start the story in Robert Walton's letters to his sister. He's in the middle of the Arctic trying to find like this Arctic passage type thing for trade. I don't know, something's happening, something important, forgotten what it is, but he's writing to his sister, and then, oh shit, this man's just come aboard my ship. He says he's Victor Frankenstein, and he's going to tell me the story of his monster. And then we get Victor's story, and it's a little bit pathetic, if I'm going to be honest. Victor Frankenstein is a whiny bastard, but we live and we learn. Then we get the monster's story, which brings everything into a different perspective. We go back to Victor with a different point of view of him, and then back to Robert Walton. It's cyclical, it bookends, and that is how we get the whole monster-man dichotomy that is present in Frankenstein, and that's why it's such a beautiful novel. Mary Shelley could have chosen a different word besides abhorrent to use on every page 2 or 3 times, but she's 18, we let it slide, we let it go, because she created one of the most poignant pieces of literature to ever have existed, in my opinion. I hate Victor as a character, but Frankenstein as a book, it holds a perfect place in my heart, and I have many things to say on Frankenstein adaptations, but that will be a different video, because that could be a hell of a video essay, full-on Lindsay Ellis style adaptations of Frankenstein. I need to write that down, because that's going to be good, and I'm going to very much enjoy doing that in my spare time. The form of your story is a little bit easier to explain. You have 4 types of form. You have fiction prose, non-fiction prose, poetry and drama, and that's your plays and your scripts and your whatnot. So your fiction prose is your standard stories, all of these buggers behind me, your short stories, your narratives, your novels, your novellas and whatnot. Then you have your poetry, which is maybe somebody's poetry here. Somebody is. Your non-fiction prose, this woman here, my Caitlin Moran, my woman, my best friend, I love her. We met, she gave me a kiss, and it was the happiest day of my life. But this is non-fiction prose. It's in a story form, full-on prose, but non-fiction. This is her life she's telling you about. Therefore, real non-fiction. Poetry we get, and then scripts we also get. Your Shakespeare, my main man, like Willie Shakes. I love him a lot. That is the basics on your 5 aspects of narrative. Once you start with those, you've got pretty much a basis of your story, and you can get on with everything else. You need to find the voices of your characters so we know who we're listening to. You need to find the right language so we know where we are and when we are. You need to find the right setting so we can have an emotional response to where the characters are. You need to find the right structure so the story builds at the right points and climaxes at the right points and resolutions are at the right place so we can come down from the high you've built us up to. And the form needs to be right. Something like Goblin Market from Christina Rossetti, the massive epic poem that she wrote, could have worked really well as a short story. It's like a warning for unmarried women to lose their virginity. It's like this, oh, careful, or you might end up eaten by goblins kind of story. But because it was written in poetry rather than fiction prose, we got that kind of folklore feel to it. So think about all of those aspects, play around with your genres, play around with your forms, your settings, and see what happens, because that's where we can have really good fun with it. Something I like to do is write from a different character's perspective. If I have a main character and I've been in their head for so long, and I have someone that opposes their point of view, to get a better understanding of why that character opposes that point of view, I write a couple of reactions from that character to what the main characters have done, but from their perspective, so I understand a little bit more and I can write that into the story a little bit better. So play around and see what you can get. I will probably do some writing challenges type things to help form these different types of ideas, because that is something that helped me when I was writing things. So I will do a video on that at some point, and I will put it in the description when it's done. At the moment it won't be done because I have other things to do, but when it's up, it won't be. And I will see you later because I have other things to film now. Farewell.